the entire agri-food sector bears the brunt of the climate crisis.
Pour parler d'agriculture et d'Europe à la jeunesse.
Proteste der Landwirte zeigen, wie wichtig der strategische Dialog ist.
La PAC, c'est plus du tiers du budget total de l'Union européenne.
We have to find a new consensus on the future of agriculture.
As we do every year, Food for Europe hosted a round table at the Grüne Week 2025, the major German trade fair for agriculture and food in Berlin. Just a year ago, farmers across Europe took to the streets. They blocked highways and city centres. They demanded fair prices, fair wages, less paperwork, and a relaxation of EU directives on agriculture and the environment. These demonstrations took place in Germany and throughout the EU. Have these protests served any purpose? This is the question that our German-speaking debate moderator and his guests tried to answer. This podcast provides you with some excerpts from the debate, and I've translated and dubbed the moderator's questions into English. Welcome to the 50th edition of Food for Europe, a summary of the live debate broadcast on YouTube and Facebook on Saturday the 18th of January during Green Week. Our guests for this round table are Christoph Hansen, European Commissioner for Agriculture; Mary Hoffmann, farmer, agronomist and influencer, or farmfluencer, with more than 1 million social media followers, more of which a little later; Hubert Heigl, the president of Naturland, an international association promoting organic farming and animal welfare that represents close to 120,000 farmers in around 60 countries; Moritz Tapp, a member of the board of directors of the German Association for the Environment and Nature Conservation; and Peter Jung, a vice president of VDL, an association that promotes academic expertise in the farming, food and environment sectors. And so the first question is one for everybody. Did the demonstrations lead to concrete outcomes?
I think that the protests have in any case had the effect of drawing society's attention to the topic of agriculture. And that's very, very important because people want to know why farmers receive subsidies or funds. And these are not always EU subsidies, but they also want to know the relationship between farming and food retail prices, for example. So we need to explain things. I think we have drawn attention to these matters and we need to maintain that attention in the future.
The new European Commissioner for Agriculture, Christoph Hansen, has been here at Green Week, and I was able to speak to him before our panel to get his perspective on the issues we're discussing. Here's his first answer.
What is important is that the Commission has responded with a simplification package which has already brought some relief but may not have benefited to all farmers. And I think it's now important that we ask ourselves the following questions. What can we further simplify within the framework of this CAP? I am in the process of implementing with my services this simplification, which will also have an impact on farmers. This is very important. As for fair prices, here too we must first and foremost work to improve the position of farmers in the value chain. But we also need to work in the future on production standards and competition from third countries so that the products that come into the single market are produced according to the same standards as those of the European Union.
Auch das war eine große Forderung unserer Landwirte.
Moritz Tapp, your reaction to that?
I don't feel that farmers are all breathing a sigh of relief just yet, but I think it's still possible. And I see my fellow farmers here nodding their heads. And I think what's really important is that we're now at a crossroads. Are we going to go backwards, pushed by the far right? Or will we succeed in establishing a sustainable agricultural system, as described in Germany by the Commission on the Future of Agriculture, and as described at EU level in the Strategic Dialogue report?
How can we ensure generational renewal in agriculture? What needs to be done today to make agriculture attractive to young people? How can we facilitate access to land for newcomers who want to make a living off the land, especially when land prices are so high? I put this to Christoph Hansen.
have a very big problem, which is that fewer and fewer young people dare to go into farming. We must identify the reasons for this reluctance and find solutions to these reasons. If you want to start a farm, you need financing. And we see that young farmers, and especially young women farmers, find it very, very difficult to obtain financing. The banks do not give them credit, and when they do provide it, the conditions are very, very bad for the farmers. I've been working on a financing initiative with the president of the European Investment Bank. 3 billion euros. It's not much, but still, these 3 billion euros will provide loans to our young farmers to be able to take over a farm and to start production. It's very, very important.
Peter Jung, if young graduates from agricultural college do indeed want to get into the sector, what advice do you have for them, and what do you expect from the European Commission?
Oh, that's a tough question, because there's certainly no ready-made answer. The 3 billion euros of aid mentioned for young farmers is certainly a good start. But I myself come from a farm. We also had the same discussions on the transfer of farms and so on. What is lacking is the security of planning. This is the biggest risk you can take because you are committed to many, many years, whether in livestock farming or, in my case, in a specialist crop farm. We specialise in vines and fruit trees. When I plant a tree or a vine, I commit myself for 30 years. And in my country in 2021, overnight, with the new phytosanitary directive, phytosanitary protection was no longer possible in protected natural areas, where we have 80% of our vines. This changed overnight. And if I invested 60,000 euros per hectare before planting a vine, that investment is gone.
Hubert Heigl, what about the organic sector? Access to land is now almost impossible. Prices per hectare are prohibitive. What's your position on this issue?
I think that on this issue, there is no difference between organic farmers and their conventional colleagues. Land is scarce, land is expensive, investments are expensive. Starting to invest and to borrow is one thing. It's important. But in my view, you need passion to take over a farm. I come from the south of Germany, where we still have more of a family farm structure, passing down through generations. But there are many farms that cannot find a buyer in their own family, because it is just not attractive. And attractiveness is not just about sustainability. It's about making a profit. Commissioner Hansen also touched on this point. We need fair prices that allow us to do business. If a farm is profitable, banks offer loans because the farm can repay them. So you need fair prices, but also it has to be fun work. That's the case here. The freedom of living on a farm is a joyful feeling.
During the farmers' protests in Europe, criticism of the European Union grew louder. One of the principal complaints was that the burden of paperwork is becoming heavier, even unbearable. So how can it be reduced? I put the question to Commissioner Christoph Hansen. Like many here around this table, he grew up on a farm and knows this subject well.
We must achieve simplification that the farmer can feel, really feel, and all levels must get involved. What I mean by that is local and national authorities as well as European authorities must move in the same direction to simplify things. But we also need to think about other measures to reduce bureaucracy, to give farmers more time in the fields and barns with their animals.
Marie Hoffman, how much time do you spend in your office rather than in the field?
Most of my time, to be frank. I can't quantify it exactly as a percentage, but it's a lot of time, and it's also a problem we have in general in agriculture. The requests are very complex. We were promised in the wake of the farmers' demonstrations a reduction in bureaucracy. So far, we haven't seen anything like that. For example, the obligation to keep documents has been reduced from 10 years to 8 years. It's not really a big step forward if paperwork needs to remain in storage for or need 2 years less. We really need greater exemptions. We need to think bigger and not start in such a piecemeal way. The German Bundestag prides itself on having made our task much easier, but this simplification is not that important.
Moritz Tapp?
It's really a question of reducing the absurd bureaucracy that complicates our work. We can now facilitate administrative tasks with digitization and the recording of remote sensing data, which was perhaps not possible at the time this regulation was introduced. And I think that we must indeed make a distinction. It should not be said that all bureaucracy is bad. There will always be a certain administrative burden. But we should, as far as possible, work with farmers to create a manageable level of bureaucracy.
Peter Jung, what's your view? Is the administrative burden too heavy?
I agree with previous speakers that there needs to be some degree of regulation. We are also transparent throughout our value chain, which is not only agriculture as such, but also the upstream and downstream sectors. No one can deny that we are making our contribution to environmental preservation and sustainability. This is a very, very important point that allows us to win favour in Europe thanks to our production method. But another very important point is, of course, the level playing field, especially with trade and imports and exports in third countries.
Europe must protect farmers from unfair trading practices. The words of European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen in early 2024. This was a reference to business practices in the agri-food industry, including in Europe, but also, of course, a reference to competition from third countries. And her statement echoed one of the main demands to have emerged from the farmers' protests a year ago. So, what did the Commission get wrong? Here's a response from Commissioner Christoph Hansen.
The mistake was to want to polarize everything. It's not all black and white. I think that must be said very clearly. We are seeing a general decline in meat production in the European Union. Over the past 10 years, the herd has decreased by more than 8%. We should not continue to accelerate this trend artificially or politically. That is my first point. Secondly, it's obviously important to put farmers back at the center of our policy. The farmers want to collaborate. We have to take him with us and not abandon him. This is not the right way to proceed.
Moritz Tapp, is that a view you share?
There are so many things that are wrong that I can't begin to list them. I think that would be beyond the scope of this debate. But I also find it interesting to look again at what's still wrong, or rather, which decisions are viewed critically by both a large part of the profession and also, for example, by environmental activists. If women farmers and environmentalists take to the streets together and shout the same message in opposition to policies proposed, there is really something wrong.
Peter Jung, what do you think went wrong?
Just one further observation to underline what was said, not to contradict it. Despite all these difficulties, we must not forget that the prosperity of Germany and the European Union comes from this international cooperation, from the internal market, and from trade with third countries. That is why we cannot be against such agreements overall, but they must be balanced. And unfortunately, in the field of agriculture, we always run the risk of being left behind, because the economic interests of the car industry, to take an example, are assessed differently by politicians.
Before I continue on this topic, my question is, what exactly is the problem? Are trade agreements with third countries worthless, or is there perhaps something to be gained from them? Here's what Christoph Hansen had to say about it.
International trade is essential for the European agriculture and food economy. This must be emphasized because we export 70 billion euros more goods each year than we import. This means that we are a net exporting continent and our farmers and food production depend on it. Of course, we know that we are tightening the screws, that we are banning plant protection products and that competition from third countries continues to produce with these products. This must no longer be the case. We have started to demand reciprocity on various phytosanitary products. We must do more of this, because it is not possible to ban on the one hand, while on the other hand, nature continues to be destroyed. And this illegal competition, this unfair competition, is coming to our market. Neither the farmer nor the average consumer understands this.
Marie Hoffmann, do you have any concrete suggestions of what should be changed and at what level?
Ja, vor allem wenn gefordert wird zum Beispiel, dass wir vielfältige Fruchtfolgen weiter in unserer
Yes, especially when it comes to the ongoing requirement to integrate crop rotation into our field systems, and then there is no outlet for the products obtained, such as legumes, pulses, beans, peas, and so on. The cultivation of these plants cannot be imposed without ensuring we have outlets, because otherwise it is not worth it. Many animal substitute products are based on soy, peas, and so on. That's what we can rely on in parallel. But the same applies to important animal products, which should really meet the same standards through trade agreements such as Mercosur, which certainly also contribute to a certain extent to geopolitical stability and security. I understand that to some extent as well, but it is not acceptable that there are then completely different standards, that the rainforest continues to be cut down, that indigenous people suffer and are deprived of their land. And that's why standards need to be high.
Hubert Heigl.
I think that in Europe, we are integrated into global international trade. I have given the reasons for this. I think everyone knows that. And it would be naive to believe that we can get out of it now, when we are all looking at the United States with some concern. The announcement of tariffs, we will see what happens in the end. I think this is not the right way. Let's take the example of Natureland as an international agricultural association. You mentioned the figure of around 120,000 members worldwide, spread over 60 countries. The same Natureland guidelines apply in all 60 countries for crop rotation, fertilization, and animal husbandry. This means that production conditions are the same for everyone. I think that in Europe we are part of this global trade system, and we cannot turn a blind eye. I don't like Mercosur either. We simply need to put our national agriculture on an equal footing in order to compete. I can do that through subsidies. I can do it through imports. And that is what I understood from Mr. Hansen, who says that the standards of imported products must correspond to European standards. In these conditions, we can be competitive. I think we have the best conditions to face our competition on an equal footing.
In your opinion, how can we maintain the continuous dialogue between farmers, the actors in the value chain, and institutions? Let's listen first to what Commissioner Christoph Hansen thinks about it.
Yes, we should not simply just discuss this. The fear of some is that the discussion will be used as an alibi. But now I think that if we want to discuss the options for the future of the common agricultural policy, we can do so through the successor body of the strategic dialogue, namely the European Committee for Agriculture and Food, where the players in agriculture, young farmers, but also the food industry will be gathered around a table to promote this dialogue. I am, of course, ready to help in other member states. I speak several languages. French would also work. It is very, very important to have a direct ear here too, and not to go only through civil servants. I think politicians need to get closer to the people. It's very, very important, I think, to seek the dialogue so that people pass on the information to me and that they know how I work and how my team works.
So, Marie Hoffmann, what's your view on how the European Commission works?
Wichtig ist nicht nur Dialogformate anzubieten, sondern wirklich auch
It is important not only to propose formats for dialogue, but also to listen actively as politicians. So it's not a question of campaigning, going to farms, making big speeches and then leaving. You have to sit down and really listen. In my experience, it's not easy for many, but I think it is very, very important to listen, to consult agronomy experts and to have them sit on the advisory teams. This is not always the case. There is no mandatory percentage of agronomists in policy-making bodies to advise politicians. We should change at least that.
Sitzen müssen, die Politikerinnen und Politiker beraten. Allein das müsste sich schon ändern.
Hubert Heigl, do you feel that this is really a dialogue that will last?
The future will tell us if these are just words or if actions will really follow. It is by their actions that they will be judged. But I would just like to broaden the view a little bit and say that we don't just need to create the discussion about agricultural policy, but we actually need to enter into a dialogue with society and to highlight that dialogue for the entire value chain. The organic food value chain employs 380,000 people, whether they are farmers, processing companies, or traders.
Moritz Tapp?
One thing I would say to the Commissioner is that it's not enough just to talk to farmers. Because at the end of the day, we find ourselves in the same situation where either those who represent the whole of society that Hubert has just mentioned, nor those who are particularly educated and committed to the environment say, yes, but this is a very one-sided vision of the whole issue. This means that dialogue is also nourished by this diversity. It can, of course, be held in 4 different languages, which Hansen seems to be fluent in. We must indeed bring together this diversity of different voices, but also give all voices the feeling that this is not wasted speaking time.
Peter Jung, are you often invited to participate in dialogue with Brussels? For farmers, this participation obviously means breaking off from their work, which is not always possible.
If farmers or other actors in the value chain do not participate in the debate, we will have a regulation that we cannot live with. How can we complain if we don't participate? And I would have liked this at European level, as Mr. Hansen says, for this format to be really experienced by these civil dialogue groups, which exist at the Commission, where I myself have the opportunity to sit on various working groups. The Commission needs to listen more to its interlocutors, because in the meantime, in recent years, it has unfortunately taken on the air of a direct confrontation, and there is certainly potential for improvement there too.
Marie Hoffman, who should be responsible for these exchanges?
It's also partly our responsibility, obviously. We need to be very transparent about this, but it must also be part of the educational program. It must be anchored more firmly again. The environment, agriculture, food, all of these go hand in hand and must be more present in the educational curriculum again. But the traditional media must also do so with well-verified information, which is not always the case, because erroneous information is sometimes conveyed, and I think it's extremely important that all stakeholders work together.
That's it for this edition of Food for Europe, live from Berlin during the Green Week. Thanks to all my guests for their contribution to this podcast, and thank you very much for listening. Join us again soon for another edition of Food for Europe.
The entire agri-food sector bears the brunt of the climate crisis.
Pour parler d'agriculture et d'Europe à la jeunesse.
Proteste der Landwirte zeigen, wie wichtig der strategische Dialog ist.
La PAC, c'est plus du tiers du budget total de l'Union européenne.
We have to find a new consensus on the future of agriculture.